Think about this scenario. You're working for an organization which has a heavy on premise footprint. So you have a couple of data centers on premise, and your business is thinking of moving things up into the cloud. So maybe you have Active Directory, on premise Exchange hybrid servers, you have moved your workloads up into the cloud, some of them. So the Exchange mailboxes, you have Teams, Yammer, OneDrive, SharePoint, all up and running. Now you're trying to move the servers up into the cloud. So the first point will be you want to extend your on-premise data center to the cloud, to the Azure. So you need some kind of connectivity over there, maybe a side-to-side VPN or an express route. But to have a starting point, you need to have a network up in the cloud. So you need to have a virtual network, a couple of subnets, a couple of virtual machines to start with. So you're tasked to actually come up with as to how we can implement a virtual network up in the cloud, like a hub and spoke model, for example. So you're a UK-based organization. Let's consider that as an example. And your primary activities is within the UK. So your cloud region is going to be UK South. It could be UK West as well. So let's pick UK South for that example. Maybe you might acquire some other businesses within Europe. So you might have a spoke model later on, in which you might want to spin up a couple more virtual networks. But for the time being, this is what we are trying to accomplish. So we want to have a virtual network with a couple of subnets, well defined with the correct subnets that we need. Maybe we'll spin up some virtual machines, see whether we can interact with these machines. And once we have that set up, then you can think about actually connecting your on-premise data center with the cloud by using a side-to-side VPN or an express route. If you are new to this channel, my name is Rajit and I work as a Microsoft cloud consultant and architect. I create videos on a daily basis around Microsoft 365 and Azure with an angle to tackle the topics covered in Microsoft certifications. So if these topics are of any interest to you, please do consider subscribing to the channel. So let's get started. So this is what we are trying to accomplish. And we have an on-premise world, and this is what we want to do. So just to explain as to what we have in this diagram. So we have one virtual network, which is in the blue box. So virtual network number one. We have three subnets, which is in green, and they are called core services subnet, the web apps, and the database, for example. And we have one VM each, say VM1, VM2, and VM3 in each of these subnets. Now, the virtual network is within a region that you pick whenever you want to create a virtual network. So that is one of the questions that you have to answer as to where you want your virtual network to be deployed. So in our case, we'll go with UK South. And the region is again bound by a subscription. So that is your billing boundary. So when we think about it, so this diagram that we have up in the screen, so let's just kind of put the boundaries over there. And let's see. So the starting point is a subscription. So this is your billing boundary. So within a subscription, you pick a region. So that is again the next boundary that you have for the virtual machine. And within the region, you have the virtual network. So you create the virtual network, and within the virtual network, you create the subnets that you need. So you have three subnets over here. So those are the ones. And we have one VM each in each of the subnet. Now, you always have to pick the network range that you want for your network, virtual network, and the subnets. So we will see those ones as we try and create that within the portal. So this is one of the main topics that is covered in the AZ-104 Microsoft Azure Administrator exam: how to create subnets, how to create virtual networks, how does region and subscription come into play, how can you have multiple virtual networks within a region and across regions, how do you talk to virtual networks which are within a region and across. So you could have peering between the virtual networks, regional peering, or you could have global peering if they are within different regions. So let's try and create a virtual network. And along with that, let's create three subnets, all bound within a region and within a subscription. So once we flip to the portal, these things might make more sense to you. So let's go into the portal. So we have portal.azure.com. So in order to bring up the first boundary that we want to create a virtual network. So this is the first thing that we want. And for that, we need to go into the search bar and pick up virtual network. So that is one way of doing it. So you have virtual networks over there. Or if you have access to virtual networks already, you might have it within the pane over here in the middle pane, as I have. So the virtual networks is over here. You also can use the left-hand menu and go down to virtual networks, which is over here. So all of these will take you to the same place. So here I don't have any virtual networks at the moment. So let's assume that I'm working for the company. I'm tasked with creating a bare bones structure. So I want to create one virtual network within the UK South, and I only have one subscription within the tenant. So let's click on create to create a virtual network. Now, the first option that you have is the name of the subscription. So I only have one subscription. If you have multiple subscriptions, you can pick and choose the right one that you need. Next one is a resource group. So I have a couple of resource groups. And for this purpose, I want to create my own resource group. So think of resource group as a container in which you will put all the resources that you are trying to build. More like a Windows folder in which you have a couple of files or different types of files. So it's kind of a container in which you have everything put together nicely. So let's create a new resource group in our case, and let's call this VNet resource group. So let's say VNet resource group and click on OK. Or let's even put hub VNet. So it's a hub and spoke model. Let's just say hub VNet resource group. You can give any name that you want, but you need to have these things well defined before you start playing with it in the portal. All right. Now, virtual network name. So this is my hub network. This is my main network, UK based. So I could go with say hub VNet. And I'm picking up UK South as the region. So this is exactly what we are trying to create as per the diagram that we have. So we have a subscription over here, which is our Azure subscription 1, and our region is UK South, and within that we are trying to create a virtual network. So three things already being dealt with in this particular portal in the first pane itself. So we have the subscription, we have the resource group, the name of the virtual network, and where you're trying to deploy the virtual network. Now, you cannot have the same virtual network in more than one region. You can have it with the same names, but the boundary of the virtual network is within the region. So you're trying to create it within UK South. Now let's click on next. Now here we have a few options which we can turn on or off. So the first one is virtual network encryption. So if you want to encrypt your traffic within the virtual network, you can click that one, and it says virtual machines must have accelerated networking enabled for this to work. And traffic to public IP addresses is not encrypted. So this is within the virtual network. So over here, so you have your subnets, your machines. So anything that flows within the virtual network that we have, within the blue boundary that we have, will be encrypted. So that's the option that we have. Second one is Azure Bastion. So Bastion is like a jump box that we have up in the cloud, which is a paid service. So when you have VMs running up in the cloud, say for example, the one that we have, so VM number one way of actually connecting to the virtual machine is to give an IP address to the virtual machine. So you can give a public IP address when you spin up a VM. But that's one of the bad ways, because you are exposing the virtual machine on port 3389 to the entire world. Yes, you can cut down and just target your own virtual machine. You can say you want to have the port open just for like 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever. So you can still further secure the access that you have, but it is not a recommended way to have a virtual machine running up in the cloud, to have 3389 open wide out, unless you are testing, of course. Now, the second option that we have is something called Azure Bastion. So this is like a jump box that you have. So that is another virtual machine. Think of it that way. So we have another virtual machine up in the cloud, and you can use that virtual machine as a jump box. So you log into the Azure Bastion service first, and then from there you connect to your virtual machine that you have in your subnet. So that is the option that it is asking over here within the portal. So do you want to have Azure Bastion service? It is a paid service, and it provides secure RDP or SSH service to the virtual machines that you want to connect over TLS. So if it is a Windows machine, it will use RDP. If it is a Linux machine, then SSH. Now you can enable Bastion even after creating the virtual network, but if you think that you will be using Bastion straight away, you can enable the box over here. And then it specifies two more options. You have to give a host name for your Bastion, and then the public IP address. So public IP will be created when you go through the wizard and create the virtual network. But if you already have a public IP address lying around in this particular VNet, then you can pick and choose one of those. But since it is a new VNet that we are trying to build, you wouldn't have that. But let's create the Bastion service later on. So let's just uncheck the box. Now, the third option that we have is Azure Firewall. So it is a layer 3, layer 7 stateful firewall that we have within Azure. So it is a managed cloud-based network service. security service that protects the virtual network resources. So if you want to have Azure Firewall, you can enable that. Again, you get further options as to the name of the firewall that you want, the subnet name. This is the name that it should have. So any Azure Firewall subnet has to have the name Azure Firewall subnet, and hence it is pre-filled and you can't make any change. Before you could actually type in the name, and people used to make mistakes and then things doesn't work. Now Microsoft has removed it as a field that you can fill in and just take the default value that it has, so you are less prone to any mistakes. So let's not enable the firewall at the moment. We are more concentrated on spinning up a virtual machine inside a subnet inside a virtual network, which is all bound within a region and a subscription. Now the last option that we have is the Azure DDoS network protection. So this is again a paid service, as you would know, that offers enhanced DDoS mitigation capabilities like attack notifications, adaptive tuning, and telemetry to protect against the impact of any DDoS attacks. So you do have basic DDoS protection within the virtual network, but if you want to enhance that, you can go for the paid option, which is the Azure DDoS network protection by enabling the checkbox. So let's not enable those ones. We can come back to that later on, and let's click on next. Now this page is very crucial. So this is where we are trying to define our subnets. So the range of the virtual network that we have, the network range, and within the network ranges, how many subnets do you want to have? So since we did check the box by going into the security tab over here, it was pre-filling the subnets that you want to create. So the Azure Bastion subnet has to be again named as Azure Bastion subnet. Similarly, Azure Firewall subnet has to be named as Azure Firewall subnet. So let's delete those two ones because we don't want those. Now, we could go with any of the address spaces that we have. So the private address spaces that we have three of them. So we have the 10/8, so 10.0.0.0/8, 172.16.00/12, and 192.168.00/16. So these are the three well-known private IP address ranges. Normally, you tend to see 10 and 192. So 192 if you're a smaller shop, 10 if you're a larger company, you tend to go with the 10/16 network. So again, we could just delete whatever has been pre-filled. You can just. So we need to have at least one address space for a virtual network. So let's define that by clicking on Add IPv4 address space. Now 10.0.0.0/16 is the pre-filled one. So that is a virtual network address, and then you can have additional subnets within that. Now let's go with something smaller. So in our case, let's go with 192. So 192.168.0.0/16. So you still have 65,536 addresses within this network range. So you have IPs from 192.168.0.0 to 255.255. So that is the entire range of the virtual network over here. So we are saying 192.168.0.0/16 as the range of the virtual network. And all of these subnets that we have, the core services subnet, the web app subnet, and the database subnet that we have will have a network address within this range that we have defined. So we'll have to carve out the IPs or the IP ranges from within the 192.168/16 address. So for that, so let's create the virtual network address. So you have 65,536 addresses. Now we need to have three subnets. You don't have to create the subnet straight away, all the ones that you need. You can always create subnets later on as well. So what we will do is we'll create one subnet now, and then once the virtual network has been spun up, then we'll go back into the portal and create the other two subnets. So we'll go with the core services subnet. Now, so let's add a subnet. So you get the option over here. So the purpose is default. So you have a few of those: Bastion, Firewall, Firewall Managed, Virtual Network Gateway, and the Route Server. So let's click on default and let's give a different name. So ours is Core Services Subnet. And include an IPv4 address space. So we have 192.168.0.0/16 as the range of the virtual network. And within that, we are carving out, let's say 192.168.1.0 to 1.255. So this is the network range that we are carving out for the subnet number one, which is core services subnet. So you'll have 256 addresses. So it's a /24. So you can again go with any kind of subnetting that you want, depending upon the number of addresses. /24 seems to be fine for my core services. So I'm thinking of core services like the servers that will host my domain controllers, maybe Exchange hybrid servers. So things, core services that I have that is running my network. So let's go with IPv4 address range 192.168.1.0/24. We don't want to make it as a private subnet at the moment. So this is a preview feature in which what they're saying is if you check it as a private subnet, it has enhanced security and it does not provide default outbound address. So you won't have any internet access from the machines that you deploy onto those subnets, which are enabled as private. By default, up until now, Microsoft Azure always provided internet access out of the box. So whenever you create a subnet, it had internet access. Unlike AWS, in which you can have a public subnet and a private subnet, and the public always has internet and the private doesn't. So they're coming up with this feature in Azure as well. So if you want to have a private subnet, then you can have that by checking this particular box. But we don't want a private one. Let's just stick with a public subnet, a normal subnet in the Azure terminology. So what we are doing over here is for this core services subnet, we are sticking the IP address range as 192.168.1.0/24. So you get 256 addresses. Now, within the address range that you have, always 5 addresses are being used by Microsoft. So for example, if you take this one, which is a easier example, 192.168.1.0. So 192.168.1.0. So the first address, the .0 is the network address. So that is taken. Then 1.1 is always taken by Azure. That is used for the gateway purposes. 1.2 and 1.3 is used for DNS purposes, again by Azure. And 1.255 is the broadcast IP address. So all these addresses, which constitute 5 addresses in the network range, are reserved. So even out of the 256 addresses that you have on a /24, the only usable ones are 251. So your first IP address that you will start using will be 1.4, because 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, all these ones are already taken. So these have been taken or reserved. So the first IP address that you will have, if you're using DHCP for this VM, will be 1.4. And then you will have 1.5 all the way up to 1.254, 255 being the broadcast. So this one is easier to explain if you are coming from a networking background or if you have some idea of subnetting. 192.168.1.0/24 is an easier example to explain the addresses that is reserved. If it is a different network, say 10 dot or 172 dot and a slash maybe 23 or 21, whatever. So the first IP in that range will be reserved for the network. The next one will be used for the gateway, and the third and the fourth will be used for DNS, and the last one within the range will be used for as a broadcast address. So those 5 IPs will be gone. So the usable ones will be 251. So that is an exam question, or they might base questions around the idea that any subnet that you deploy within Azure will have 5 IPs reserved, and the usable ones are the rest. So if it is a /24, it is 251. All right, so let's go back and let's create this 192.168.1.0/24 for the core services subnet. So that is what we are trying to explain here. So this is the range of our network, 192.168.0.0/16, which you can't change because that is what you have selected on the left-hand side. And the starting IP for your subnet is 1.0 with a /24, which means this is the range of IPs that you can use, 192.168.1.0 to 1.255. All right. So let's go into security. It's asking whether you want to have any NAT gateways. We don't want any at the moment. If you do want one, you can create. Network security group is, again, a concept that you have within Azure, similar to Azure Firewall. But again, this is something that you stick in for access. So you create rules based on inbound and outbound traffic that you want to have. And then you combine them as a network security group, or you stick those rules in a network security group, and you can apply that to a subnet, or you can apply to that to a virtual machine, to a NIC that you have. Route tables, you don't want to have any route tables at the moment. So these are all the ones that you can do even later on. So we just want to create the subnet and deploy a VM and see how these things work. Service endpoint, it allows traffic to specific Azure resources from your virtual network over service endpoints. We don't want to have that now. We don't want any subnet delegations to a particular service, and any network policy for private endpoints. So private endpoint is one in which you are trying to control the traffic or make the traffic go all the way private within the subnet, so within the Microsoft network itself. So if you want to have access to a virtual appliance from an application or any other resources, you can have it routed through a private route. So here we are just going with the subnet. So we have all the information that we need over here. These are the only things that you need to worry about while creating a subnet. So let's click on add. So that comes in over here. So the name of the subnet is core services subnet. This is the range. The size is a /24. There's no NAT gateway that we have provided. So it says a NAT gateway is recommended for outbound internet access from subnets, especially if you have a private subnet. We don't have a private subnet because we haven't enabled that option. So let's click on next. Again, tags, as we have seen in Microsoft 365 and Azure, it is an optional value in which it is a name value pair. So if you want to have this particular virtual network tags like, okay, which department is managing it? You can say, okay, name department is core services or anything that you have. So this is like more information so that whenever it kind of gets expanded out within the Azure network, you have more and more resources being deployed, more virtual networks, more regions. It makes sense to have the tags so that you know who is responsible for these things and who deployed it in the first place. You might have a cost center associated with it. So, for billing purposes, who is it going to be billed against? So these are the things that normally happens in larger companies. If you're a small shop and you're trying to put a small virtual network together, these things may not apply. So these are completely optional tags. So I just put in department is equal to core services. I could go for a cost center and say cost center number is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And click on next. Now, Azure is running the validation based on the options that we have selected. So based on the network range that we have selected for the virtual network, for the subnets, the name of the subnets, and if the validation passes, then you can see as to what we have selected over here. So the name of the subscription, the resource group, the name of the VNet. So this is Hub VNet. We are deploying it in UK South. And the security options that we have, the paid ones are all disabled. This is the address range that we have for the VNet that we have, 65,536 addresses. And we are deploying one subnet, which is core services subnet with a /24 address. And we are putting in some tag values over here. I'm not sure as to why the tag values are repeated. Let's click on create and wait for the deployment to complete. So it has initialized the deployment. So you can always keep track of as to what's going on by keeping an eye on the right-hand side toast. So here it says submitting the deployment. Once the deployment has been submitted, then it starts spinning up the resources that we need, and it will give you a time breakdown as to what's going on and the different steps that it is taking. So if we close this off and if you go and expand the deployment details, it's slowly filling in, and you will have the options pretty much over here now. So we have deployed one resource, which is a hub virtual network. It is of type virtual network. Everything is good. Operational details. And these are the options. It has created the provisioning operation, the succeeded state, which means that we have completely created what we are intending to create. It took 9 seconds for the entire operation to complete, and everything is fine. The resource name is hub VNet, and then the deployment correlation ID and stuff. So let's close that off. And now we could go into the resource by clicking on the go to resource option. So we have deployed the virtual network itself, this blue box, and we have deployed the green box. So this much is being done. Now we have to spin up two more subnets, and maybe one VM or two VMs or even three VMs for that matter. So let's go back. So this is our virtual network. So you can always go back to home and we can pick up virtual networks from here. And then you can go into the virtual network that we have created, Hub VNet, and it is in location UK South. It is within the resource group, Hub VNet resource group, and the subscription is Azure subscription 1. So let's click on that one, and it brings up the properties of the virtual networks. So the main options are in the middle pane. So it shows again the resource group, the location, which you can't change, the subscription ID, the address space that we have selected for the VNet 192.168.0.0.16. The DNS server is Azure provided DNS service. That is the case out of the box. You have flow timeout, which you can configure, BGP configurations, again, network related stuff. Virtual network ID is this. This is the ID of your virtual network that you have created. Now we have 5 capabilities listed within the middle pane. So the first one is the DDoS protection, which we said is a paid service. It is set to not configured. So you can always configure these things after deploying the virtual network. So similarly, the Azure firewall, the peerings, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and the private endpoints. So the peering is one in which we want to connect 2 or more virtual networks together. So what we are saying is, if I can get the drawing out and try and make my wonderful drawing. So what we are saying is, if you have 2 virtual networks, 2 or more, it doesn't have to be 2, you can have more than 2. Now, so this is virtual network number 1, for example, VNet 1, and you might have another VNet, say VNet 2. So if you have 2 or more virtual networks, you can connect them together. So by default, connectivity within the resources in the virtual network is allowed. So if you have subnets, like these 3 different subnets within a virtual network, the traffic between the subnets and the resources are allowed out of the box. But if you have another virtual network similar to the one that we just draw, so let's just draw it here. So if we have another virtual network called VNet 2, and if you want this particular VNet to talk to VNet number 1, so if you want this connectivity, it is not enabled out of the box, but you can make that connection by something called VNet peering. So we are trying to connect the 2 VNets together. That is what VNet peering is all about. So again, these VNets can be within the same region, or it can be across multiple regions. So you can have both the VNets in the same region. So this could be region 1 or maybe UK South, for example, in our case. So you can have 2 VNets or more VNets, and you can combine them together by using VNet peering. So you can combine these 2 together. Now, if they are in 2 different regions, so we have, for example, VNet 1, VNet 2, VNet 2. This is in region number 1, and this is in region 2, for example. Let's say this is in UK South. Number 1 is in UK South, and VNet 2 is in West Europe. So you could use, again, peering again. So if it is across the regions, then you could use global peering and then connect them together. So that is what this option is all about, the peerings. Defender for Cloud, it's again strengthening the security posture for your environment. So again, comes from the Defender family. And the last one that we have is private endpoints. So privately access Azure services without sending the traffic across the internet. So as it says from the name, private endpoints, you're trying to connect the resources with the networks using the private network that we have within and not using the internet. So we can define these things later on. Now let's go into the left-hand menu that we have. So within settings, you have the address space. So this is where it shows the address space that we have configured. So we have 192.168.0.0/16. This is the address space of the virtual network. If you have peered virtual networks, if you have connected this virtual network with another one, that will come up over here. Connected devices will show the IP addresses and the device types. So the name of the machine, type of the device that you have, and the IP addresses, and the subnet that it belongs to. So if you have virtual machine 1 running over here, so if you spin a virtual machine number 1, VM1, it will have an IP address, possibly 192.168.1.4, and it will be within the core services subnet, and those information will be surfaced here. Now subnets, if you click on that one, you can see the single subnet that we have created so far, core services subnet. We want to create 2 more. So we want the web apps and the database subnet. So let's do that. Let's click on subnet, and let's give a network range of 2.0 in our case, and let's give it as web apps subnet. We don't need any other options that we have. Just click on add, and it saves the subnet configuration. And the subnet IP range that we are providing should be within the virtual network range. So you cannot have 192.168 as the virtual network address space and then have, say, 10.00 as a subnet. That doesn't work. Let's create one more subnet. So let's click on subnet. Let's give it a different name, database subnet, and let's make it as 3.0. So we have 1.0, 2.0, and say 3.0. Let's click on add. So we have three subnets created as we have in the diagram: core services, web apps, and databases. And traffic between these subnets within the virtual network are allowed out of the box. So if you have VM spun up over here, VM number 1 and VM number 2, you will be able to connect them together, or you can ping if they are allowed. And then you have connectivity between the subnets. So let's go back. So we have three different subnets defined. You can create a gateway subnet. So if you want to have that, so click on gateway subnet. Again, this is of type virtual network gateway. You give again the address that you want, and you click on add. Similarly, you can have the firewall network. So if we go with Azure Bastion, so you can say, okay, the name of the subnet is pre-filled, Azure Bastion subnet. You could provide, say, 5.0, let's say 4.0 as the Bastion one. You may not want to have /24 because it is a large enough range, and Bastion, you're just using it as a jump box. You might want to have a smaller range, maybe a few IP addresses, maybe 5 jump box maximum. So it is picking up /26 by default, but you can always flip it back and say you want to have more than that. It's entirely up to you, and depends on your network diagram that you want to build. So let's say Azure Bastion, let's add that. And let's also add an Azure Firewall subnet. Spinning up the subnet doesn't mean that you're spinning up the actual Bastion service or the firewall. You're just spinning up the network resource that we need for that. So Azure Firewall, again, the name of the subnet is pre-filled in, and let's go for 5.0. So it is giving us a /26. So it is cutting off the option in which you can select a larger range. It is only giving me 64 addresses for the firewall. And again, that's more than enough for spinning up a firewall, or more than one firewall that you need for your virtual network. So let's click on add. So now we have completed what we have intended to have as per the diagram that we have. So subscriptions, within the subscription, we have a region, which is our UK South. We have created the virtual network number 1, which is named as Hub VNet. We have deployed the 3 subnets. Now we want to spin up a virtual machine in the subnet. So we have all of these, and we can see the address spaces that we have. So in order to spin up the virtual machines, let's go and search for it. Virtual machines, that's over here. You can also go to the left-hand side and spin up virtual machine by selecting virtual machines option over there. They all come into the same user pane. So let's click on create and say I want to spin up an Azure virtual machine. Let's wait for the options to come up. Again, it is asking for the subscription, which is the same one that we have. Resource group, we possibly want to put them together in the same resource group. So Hub VNet resource group. Virtual machine name, let's say VM1. In my case, it is going in UK South. Yes. Availability zone is about any redundancy that you want to have. So you have various ways, availability zones, where in which you're physically separating your resources within a region. You can have a virtual machine scale set, where in which you are distributing the VMs across zones and fault domains at scale. Now, these are slightly off topic in the sense that, it's kind of out of scope as to what we are trying to deploy. And you also have availability set, when which you're automatically distributing your VMs across multiple fault zones. This is all about redundancy for your virtual machine. So let's just go with no redundancy required. And let's pick a Windows machine. Let's pick on Windows Edition, Windows Server 2022. And let's go for 64. Run with Azure Sport discount. We don't need any sport discounts. So as it says over here, Azure Sport offers unused Azure capacity at a discounted rate. So what it does is, if there is enough Azure capacity, unused capacity, and you want to spin up a machine, you can go for that. So the rate of the machine becomes cheaper. But the trouble is that the workloads should be tolerant to the infrastructure loss, as Azure may recall the capacity. So whenever someone else comes in and starts paying for the service, or spin up another 10 virtual machines and they're paying for it, the sport ones may be taken off. So these are like temporary capacity that becomes available within Azure, which they are giving out for the customers on a discounted price. So let's not do that. And the size, we could go for a D4S V3. So 4 CPU, 16 gig of RAM. So you also have free service eligible, because I have signed up for an Azure free tenant, which gives you 1 month of credits worth $200. So if you are coming from a non-US region, you will get the equivalent of your region-based currency that you have. So maybe let's go with the free service eligible. Let's see how fast we can spin up a machine using 1 CPU and 1 GB. That's quite low unless we are going for a Linux-based machine. Let's just go with the paid one. Let's just go with 4 CPUs and 16 gig of RAM. You can destroy it later on once we have set it up. We don't want to enable hibernation. Let's go with the username. So this is the administrator username for your machine. So let's just type in administrator. Let's see what happens. It says usernames must not include reserved words. So these kind of common usernames are blocked by default by Azure. So you cannot have administrator as the name of the local administrator account for the machine that you're spinning up. So let's go with, say, super admin, for example. Oh, that's good. And let's stick in a password. That's good enough. Let's confirm the password. All right, that's looking good. Now here we are saying inbound port rules. Select which virtual machine network ports are accessible from the public internet. So this is where I was saying you could have access to the virtual machine using port 3389 from the internet. So that is one way of accessing the virtual machine that we have. So let's just say this is the internet. And if you want to access this particular VM that is in our subnet within our virtual network all up in Azure, you can connect directly to the VM if we provide port 3389 open and if we have a public IP for this virtual machine. So you need to have a public IP address because you need to have some way of connecting to the virtual machine, which is a public IP, and you need to have the port open. So that is possible, but that is not recommended unless you are testing it out. So here, let's just go with 3389 as the allowed port because we haven't spun up Azure Bastion and we just want to make a test connection. Let's click on next for the disks. Now it is coming up with the OS disk size, so 127 gig. That's good enough. We could go with a premium SSD, which is much more expensive. You could go for a standard SSD or a standard hard disk. So standard HDD will not give you the best performance that you need. The best performance will be always for premium SSD. You could also go with the standard one. Let's just stick with premium SSD for the time being. We just want to test it out and we don't want to have any kind of delays. Now, delete the operating system with a VM. So when you try and delete the virtual machine, what we are saying over here is we want the disks to be deleted as well. So if you want to have the disk remaining, then you can uncheck the box so that when you delete the virtual machine, the disks will stay within Azure, but the VM will be taken off and you can attach that virtual disks onto a different machine if you so prefer. Now, we want to delete the disk along with the VM. When we do that, key management is again platform managed key. You can have custom keys for encryption. So a disk encryption set stores the customer key that a disk or a snapshot will use for encrypting its data. So it is always best to go with a Microsoft managed key unless you have a compliance requirement in which the organization has to have full control of the key. In that case, you can go for the custom managed key option. Now, enable ultra disk compatibility. We don't need that. Now, let's just, if you want to have more than one disk, apart from the OS disk, if you want to have more than that, you can always create and attach a new disk over here. If you already have an existing disk lying around, then you can always attach an existing disk. I don't need another drive. I'm good with 127 gig of C drive, which contains the OS disk. So that's good enough for me. But if you do want to have more of that, when you are in a production environment and deploying a virtual machine, then you can always create and attach a new disk as part of the virtual machine creation, or you can attach it later on as well. Next is networking. So here, virtual network, we only have one. So that's kind of selected. The virtual network name is Hub VNet. You can always create a new one as well from the same wizard. Now, the subnet that we have over here, so it will list all the subnets that we have created. So the core services 192.168.1, database subnet, and the web app subnet. So we want to deploy this one, which is kind of our server that is going to be the domain controller in the core services subnet. So let's select that one. And since we enabled port 3389 as an allowed option in the previous wizard, it is saying that we want to create a new public IP address, and it is giving the name as VM1-IP. So that's a new public IP address that will be assigned once the virtual machine has been deployed. So let's stick with that. And now network security group, we have basic network security group already selected. Let's go with that one. We'll see as to what it is in detail later on. Public inbound ports, we are allowing 3389. Now delete the public IP and the NIC when the VM is deleted. Yes, as it is a test case, I would like to do that. I don't want to incur more cost by keeping the public IP address once I have deleted the virtual machine. Enable accelerated networking, that's been checked. And that is also an option that you have to check if you went for encryption while creating the virtual network. We did not select that particular option, but let's just enable that one anyway. We don't want any load balancing option for one virtual machine that we are trying to deploy. But if you are trying to keep this machine behind a load balancer, then you can always go ahead with creating the load balancer as well in the same single shot while creating the virtual machine. Or you can come back and create the load balancer later on and then add or attach the virtual machines onto the load balancer at a later stage. Next, click on management. Now, these are the options in which it is all about managing the virtual machines. So whether you want to have system assigned management identity, we don't want that. Login with Microsoft Entra ID. If you want Microsoft Entra ID credentials to be used to log into this particular machine, which means that the machine will be part of Entra ID. We don't want that. We are trying to replicate or move a server from the on-premise up into the cloud. So we want to make this one as a domain controller, install Windows, promote it as a domain controller, provided that we have some sort of connectivity to the on-premise world. So either a site-to-site VPN, preferably, or express route if you're a larger organization. Enable auto shutdown. So this is the option in which you're saying that I don't want this particular virtual machine to be running past my work hours. If that is the case, if it is a test machine, especially, you can enable that the machine has to be shut down past, for example, in this case, it is 7 p.m. I could change it to 5 p.m., which means the machine will automatically shut down at 5 p.m., whether you do it or not, so that I don't incur the full cost of having a virtual machine running when I don't need that. So I don't need that one because I intend to delete this one after the recording. So let's uncheck the option. But if you do want to have that, you can go for it. Now you can enable backup. Again, we don't want this one because it is a test machine. You can enable the backup. You can create the recovery service world. You can go for the type of the backups that you need, whether it's a standard or enhanced. So multiple backups per day, 1 to 30 days operational tier. And you can go with the backup policies, all of those options. Let's just not go ahead with that one now. We don't need site recovery or guest OS patches. None of those ones at the moment. Let's click on next for the monitoring. Now, alerts, enable recommended alert rules. You could do that. If it is a production one, then you can always stick in the email address where you want to have the alerts to be sent. I don't need those ones now. Let's just deploy the virtual machine with the basic default options. Boot diagnostics, it is recommended to have it enabled using a storage account. Let's not do that for the time being. I don't need any enable OS guest diagnostics or the health monitoring at the moment. If you do want that in production, always go for it. Now let's click on advanced. I don't need to have any extensions or custom data or anything of that sort at the moment. So let's just go with next, which gives me the tag options. I don't want any tags. Let's click on create. Now creating the virtual machine and all the options that it goes along with that one will be a separate video on its own. I just want to create the virtual machine as part of this deployment so that we can complete the network scenario that we have and log into the machine and just make sure that it gets the right IP address, and we can go from there. So let's wait for the deployment to complete. So it is running the validation. Once the validation has been completed, the create button will be enabled and we can click on the create option. So validation has been passed. So let's click on create. So it's going to deploy it in UK South and within the resource group that we have specified. And it's going to be a 2022 data center edition generation 2 with 4 CPUs, 16 gig of RAM, super admin being the local administrator account that I should be using when I want to log in for the first time. It is going in the core services subnet with the IP range 192.168.1.0/24 and is going to have a new public IP address to which I can connect on. So let's go and click create for the virtual machine to be deployed. It takes a few minutes for the virtual machine to be deployed. So it is initializing the deployment, as you can see from the right-hand tossed options. Let's click on that one. Let's see whether we have any other alerts coming up pertaining to this particular deployment. And let's wait for the deployment to be complete and I'll come back. So you can see the deployment has been completed. So if you expand the deployment details, it gives you a step-by-step information as to what has been done. So you have a virtual machine being created, VM1. You have a network interface being created, VM1470, and a public IP address and a network security group along with that. So these are the resources that we have within the resource group called Hub VNet RG. So if we click on that one, and if you go into it, you will have these resources listed. So the machine has been deployed. You can go to the resource, so that is the virtual machine itself, and then you can see all the details pertaining to the machine that we have. So the machine public IP address that we have is 172.167.135.53. So you can copy that and you can connect to that particular virtual machine, which is running Windows Server 2022. So let's just do that. Let's just go into RDP and let's just paste the IP address. Given the username that we specified, which is super admin in my case, let me punch in the right password. And you should be able to connect to the virtual machine by clicking yes, which is now within our core services subnet within the virtual network that we created all up in Azure. So this is the machine that we have running Windows Server 2022. And now let's just check the IP address real quick just to make sure that it is coming from the right subnet and that it is not dishing out any of the reserved IPs, which it won't anyway. Let's wait for the machine to fully load. And let's just go into the terminal. It's taking a bit of time as it is loading for the first time. And subsequent RDP sessions will be much more faster. So let's just go into PowerShell. Let's click on yes. And let's just say ipconfig. So as I have mentioned, so the IP address that you are getting is 192.168.1.4 as the first IP address, even though the subnet that we have is 192.168.1.0. So 0.1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 has been reserved by Microsoft. So the first usable IP address will be 1.4. And that is what we have in our machine. So 1.4, you have the server manager being opened up by default. Let's just close that off. We have now successfully deployed a Windows Server 2022 based virtual machine up into the cloud as per the diagram that we had when we started with. So virtual network number one. So let's just go over here. We created the virtual network over here as per the diagram within the region that we have UK South, within the Azure subscription number one that we have within our tenant. And then we created 3 different subnets, named it correctly, and then we spun up VM number one within the core services subnet. We understood that it has the right IP address. We could deploy VM2 and VM3 in those subnets, web apps, and the database, but then the video is going to be lengthy and the process is going to be the same. So you could have these ones created by yourself. In your spare time, you can just select web app subnet for VM number 2 and database subnet for VM number 3. So those are the only 2 differences when you compare with VM number 1 creation. So you have to select the right subnet so that you get the right IP address and it goes into the right place as per the diagram that we have over here. So this topic is very crucial, how to create virtual networks, subnets, subnetting, the virtual network address space and the subnet address spaces that you have, the different types of subnets that you can create like the Azure Firewall, the Azure Bastion, network gateways, and the default ones which are used for creating any number of subnets that you have or that you want to have within your virtual network, and how to assign an IP address for a virtual machine, a public one, and then how you connect to the virtual machine by using the public IP address. So let me just quickly shut down the machine. You can close it off over here. You can go into the portal and shut down the virtual machine. So if you go into virtual machines over here, click on virtual machine number one that we have. It brings all the properties. You could say stop and click on yes, and it stops the virtual machine that we have. Now, if you want to delete everything that you have done so far, not to incur any cost, you can go into the resource group. So search for resource group and just delete the entire resource group. So if you go into the hub virtual network resource group that we have, you will have all the resources. So we have the virtual network itself. We have the VM, which is virtual machine number one. We have the public IP address associated with the VM. We have the network security group for the VM. We have the network interface, which goes on the VM, and the operating system disk as well. So all of these resides within this particular container called a resource group. So the resource group name is Hub VNet Resource Group. So if you want to delete all of these at the end of the exercise, you can just delete the resource group by clicking the delete resource group option. Copy the resource group name because you have to specify that over here, and apply force delete for selected virtual machines. Yes, and you can click delete. If you have any questions around the subject that we have talked about so far, please do put them in the comment section and I'll try my best to respond in a timely manner. So if this video has been informative for you, please do consider subscribing to the channel and also try and share the channel with any of your friends who might find these videos more useful. Thank you.